like to introduce Mark Finn, who's going to run the panel probably, unless Jeff takes it. Jeff Shanks and Scott Cupp. We're going to turn it over to them, and so let's have some fun.
All right, thanks, guys. Welcome to Howard Days.
Yeah.
Great to have you here. All right, Mark, why don't we start with you? Let's introduce ourselves real quick.
Sure. I'm a regular here, I think most of you know. My book, Blood and Thunder, The Life and Art of Robert E. Howard, was nominated for a World Fantasy Award in 2007 and is now available in an expanded second edition. I also write fiction and comics and all sorts of other good stuff, and a lot of my work is definitely influenced by Howard and his writing. So,
I'm Jeff Shanks. I'm an archaeologist and a pop culture historian. I do a lot of academic work with Howard, doing articles and that sort of thing. I've just edited a collection of academic essays on weird tales that'll be coming out later this year. It should be in October. It's part of a series that S.T. Joshi did, and that's sort of my thing. I've been working on Howard scholarship for probably the past 5 or 6 years, I guess now.
Mm-hmm.
And I've become a regular now too. I got sucked into this, and here I am. Scott.
Hi, I'm Scott Cupp, short story writer from San Antonio, a Howard fan for the last 50 years or so, and Howard's one of my muses because I love to write about the West and weird things. I do that a lot. I co-edited the Cross Plains Universe, which is Texans Celebrate Robert E. Howard, which was published for the centennial of his birth by the World Fantasy Convention. And I don't know if there are copies over in the Howard House right now, but I have copies for them in my trunk, so they'll be some later today. And what neither of these two guys knows is I was a founding member of the H.P. Lovecraft, the Esoteric Order of Dagon.
I didn't know that.
I didn't know that either.
Wow.
All right, cool.
I tend to forget about it.
So do I.
I think we need to get Sandy Cupp up here. She needs to be on this panel.
She knows where the bodies are buried. So,
I buried him.
She's one of them.
Mark, you wanna lead us off? What do you think?
well, as we had mentioned earlier, and I think most of you know, Howard and Lovecraft were friends. They were correspondents back at a time when, if you wanted to talk to somebody long distance, the best way to do it was with letters. And even though the Howards had a telephone, and I'm sure Lovecraft had one too, long distance would not have been real feasible. And letters actually were a way for people to communicate very deep thoughts. And Lovecraft in particular was, I would say, almost a compulsive letter writer. He is... If the Cthulhu Mythos hadn't been the thing it was, we would still be studying Lovecraft's letters for the number of them that he wrote and the people that he wrote them to, and the company that he kept. So it's to our advantage that he and Howard were friends, and that they did have their correspondence. What's interesting about it is when Lovecraft passed away in 1937, it turns out that most of the letters that he had written to and from people, we're talking upwards of 100,000 different letters at this point. This is a massive body of work. There were only 2 correspondence letters that he kept, and one of those was Howard's. And so their friendship is to our benefit, because it's through Howard and Lovecraft's correspondence that we have learned much of what we know about both men. But as a relationship goes, it was at times encouraging, at times acrimonious and rancorous, and was something that was instrumental to both writers in terms of developing stories. I would say that it was more to Howard's advantage than Lovecraft's, because it allowed Howard to develop some things in his fiction that he might not otherwise have addressed had he not been having an ongoing conversation with Lovecraft about. So.
Can you imagine if they'd had text messages back and forth?
Oh, they would have broken the internet. And that's what's interesting about. I'll tell you my favorite thing about the letters, and then I'll let one of the other guys talk. In Means to Freedom, the 2-volume collection. If you can find a copy of them, either hardcover or softcover, and you're really interested in this, I recommend them, because it puts the letters in chronological order. Now, one thing about the letters in being in chronological order is this: there were actually 2 tracks in their conversation. Early on, between their back and forth, and their back and forth reads very much like internet chat room stuff now. They go by each paragraph and answer each paragraph in turn, and so you can literally follow the thread of the conversation that way. Early on, when they were still getting to know one another, one of them sent the other one some newspaper clippings about some folklore, and I think included a postcard of a trip that they'd been on. And so that started a second track that was mostly articles, short stories and poems, photographs, and postcards.
The occasional rattlesnake rattles.
And the occasional rattlesnake rattles. So there was the souvenir travelogue track, and then there was the barbarism versus civilization track. And so when you're reading the books the letters in A Means to Freedom, you have this wonderfully histrionic letter where they're screaming back and forth at each other about, I did not say that the physical was more important than the mental. I merely stated a preference. And Lovecraft is saying, just because I'm saying that your idea is foolish doesn't mean I'm calling you a fool. And then right after that is, thanks very much for the postcard that you sent last week. I really enjoyed the vistas, and the poem was great. Would you want the poem back? And then, they'd be like, no, keep the poem. That's fine. I wanted you to have a copy. I have multiples. Let me know if you need anything else, and I'll be happy to send it to you. Regarding your letter of the 14th, and so it's a wonderfully, almost a schizophrenic sort of a thing. But I think it also illustrates how, on one hand, they knew that this was a sort of an intellectual exercise, a debate, a conversation that wasn't necessarily something that they were taking personally, until, of course, they took it personally and started arguing from that point of view.
Yeah, and so getting back to one of your points about how they influenced each other, people often talk about how much influence Lovecraft had on Howard, and it was tremendous. There's no doubt about that. And but it's a shame that Howard, I think, didn't have more influence on Lovecraft. I think in a lot of ways it might have improved some of his stories. Of course, I'm biased, obviously. But you do get that somewhat. I think the action sequence in Shadows over Innsmouth, maybe when the guy's running from the hotel and those kind of things, So there are a few things where I think Lovecraft did try to interject a little bit more action into his stories after he started corresponding to Howard. But I do think the influence was definitely more one-sided, and you see it almost right away in their correspondence. You see them starting to talk about themes that immediately show up in some of Howard's stories right away. And I think when we talk about mythos, that's sort of a post-Lovecraft idea. That's kind of a modern idea. In any case, a sort of shared universe continuity idea. These guys did start using each other's name dropping each other's characters and these sorts of things, and it starts very early in their correspondence when Howard asks him about some of these characters like Yog-Sothoth and the Necronomicon. Is that a real thing? I saw you mentioned it, and so did this other guy. And Lovecraft kind of spills the beans. Well, the reason that other guy mentioned it is because I was actually rewriting his story for him. I was actually ghostwriting that, so I was dropping, some of my characters and things in there, names in there. So and then at that point he invited Howard to do the same. Right off the bat, and he uses a word that we often use when we talk about Howard and Lovecraft and these guys, verisimilitude. These guys realized right away that even though they didn't have words like continuity or retcon or shared universe, they got the idea that if they sort of understood instinctively that it makes it kind of cool if you start seeing these same names in different authors. It does give it that sense of being all part of one world and tying everything in together. It makes things seem a little bit more real. So those guys were into that. That's the sort of thing we take for granted today with these massive superhero universes and crossovers and that sort of thing. But these guys were kind of cutting edge with this sort of thing. It didn't happen very much prior to this. This idea of multiple authors sharing in a universe. And so Lovecraft and Howard and Smith and Block and all these guys were really sort of at the forefront of doing that sort of thing. Scott, do you want to jump in?
And one of the things I find most interesting is they both love to write about where they lived, but those places were so different. I mean, Lovecraft is essentially a Victorian lost out of time and stuck in New England, and Howard is J. Frank Dobie with a little bit of more literary talent. And the fact that they were friends, to me, is kind of like James Joyce and Jack London being friends.
Yeah.
But they did have a good influence on each other, and I think it's wonderful. And we'll talk a bit more about some other things.
So let's talk about Howard's so-called mythos stories. All right. Let's talk about these a little bit. Those pick up. He starts right after his correspondence begins, almost immediately, within 2 or 3 letters, you see elements of their conversation start to appear in what becomes some of the first, quote, mythos stories of Howard's, where, I think that's that's kind of talking about a retcon, using that term as sort of a retcon, because that's not really what's going on. It's Howard starting to just name drop and use, some of these elements. But the Black Stone is an early one, Children of the Night is an early one. You see right away as they start talking about things, and Lovecraft kind of invites Howard to start playing around with this. They jump right in. Why don't we talk about some of those early stories? Mark, you just did a paper on Black Stone.
I did, in fact. I presented in New Orleans this year and wrote a paper about the Black Stone as sort of. It's widely been considered Howard's best mythos story, and it's also widely considered to be one of the best mythos stories not written by Lovecraft. And so I kind of wanted to talk about and look at what makes it, why that's so, and without getting too into it, because I don't want to necessarily read the whole thing. In fact, I'm not going to read any of it. Yeah, this is too much. The gist of it is that Howard and Lovecraft, prior to the writing of the Black Stone, had been talking about folklore and how the folklore drifts and changes to fit different environments. And he was fascinated with this idea of reusing folklore in different things, and they both had a shared influence. Arthur Machen was the guy that both of them liked for pretty much the same reason. He wrote about lost races and these sort of throwback little people. And that captured both of their attentions. In Lovecraft's case, his version of that were, these white, in the White Ape it was making, but for Lovecraft it was to take that and sort of show how the deep ones were regressing back along a fish sort of line, and with Howard, it was showing how the Picts had regressed back to a kind of a brutish, sort of Neanderthal type of existence. And of course, all this is hogwash. I mean, evolutionarily, it's hogwash. But at the time, it was a really good story. And it was fun and interesting, and it scared both of them because they were afraid of miscegenation. So what makes the Blackstone interesting is it's Howard working with these themes his way, and and I know that seems like a weird sort of a difference. What most of the guys were doing, even this first run of Cthulhu Mythos contributors like Robert Bloch and Frank Belknap Long, they picked up on the formula of strange book plus curious narrator equals unpronounceable monster and gibbering terror. For them it was sort of a Mad Lib fill in the blank. And with Howard was more interested in illustrating the concepts behind the story that he was telling. And so that's why the Blackstone doesn't read like other things. It has, in that regard, it has its own sort of internal weirdness that Lovecraft was able to write about, because it was coming out of Lovecraft's head. And I went looking. I thought there was a quote where Lovecraft basically says, of all the guys writing these stories, Howard was the only guy who really got it.
That does sound familiar.
And I can't find the quote. I'd seen it once and it disappeared on me, and it's not in the. It's one of Lovecraft's letters to somebody else, but the Blackstone works on that level because it's sort of a one-off, and Howard didn't write a lot of stories in the Cthulhu Mythos vein because it wasn't quite his bag. I mean, I think he was really fascinated with it and loved to put that stuff in other things, which is why the monsters show up in almost all of the other Howard series character stories going forward. Conan's got some, tentacular goodness in it, and why shouldn't it? Brad McMorrin as well. But the other thing that the paper talks about is there's a book that's been on the Robert E. Howard bookshelf for a long time, and no one has ever really gotten into it to take a look at it and see what makes it tick. Jeff tracked down a copy and took a look at it and said, "Hey, Mark, you need to check this out." So the book is called Sex and Sex Worship.
Phallic cults and
phallic worship with a special infant. Yeah, you can understand why none of us have been interested in picking it up.
1922 by Augustus Wall.
But what's interesting about it is it is framed as an educational treatise, and it describes in very clinical detail with strange commentary that's almost poetic in nature of the history of fertility rites, all of the different myths and legends that deal with these things, all the different tribes around the world who have unusual practices. It's it's actually a very scholarly text. Now, make no mistake, it was also designed to titillate, of course, but as a book, it ends up being a reference point because all of the stuff that takes place during the Midsummer Eve ritual that Howard's character watches in the Blackstone is straight out of this book. And so in this regard, if we can get back to our SAT days, the Necronomicon is to Margaret Murray's The Witch Cults in Western Europe as Unaussprechlich and Culten is to Sex and Sex Cults, or Sex and Sex Worship by O.A. Wall. So it was definitely the origin of some of the stuff that Howard was using, and that alone is kind of an interesting thing because we'd always assumed that these were books that he'd bought for research on the Spices. And in fact, he had them much earlier and did something much different and frankly much cooler with them. So
Just as a side note, there's several, been going through the book, there's several things in Wall's book that influence some of the Conan stories as well. There's Baal Pitor in Shadows over Zambula, or Man Who Uses Zambula.
Yep.
He makes sort of a joke. There's this character that, you get the idea that he's well endowed, apparently, and he makes this kind of joke. Well, the temple girls know why I'm called Baal, Pitor. And it doesn't really make much sense, but if you read, in Augustus Wall's book, it has a whole cult of this character, Baal Peor, missing the T. And he's essentially like a Priapus type god in the Near East, fertility god, right? So there's also some things in Frost Giant's Daughter, but it's the influence on Black Stone is tremendous.
Yeah.
And you mentioned Unos Spreklichen Kulten, and I hope Dirk is not here because I'd probably just butchered that German.
Yeah. I didn't even try.
Right, but this is of course Nameless Cult. So why don't we talk about this a little bit? This was Howard's attempt to create one of these fictional books like Lovecraft's Necronomicon. And at the time, they were Lovecraft. You mentioned Murray's witch cults, and Howard and Lovecraft were talking in their letters about fertility cults. And Lovecraft is pushing Margaret Murray. She was a sort of a popular anthropologist at the time, pushing her witch cults in Europe book. And he tried to recommend that book to everybody. He loved that book. And Howard, as he's going to write The Black Stone, wants to incorporate fertility cults into this story. And of course, he didn't have a copy of Murray's book, but apparently he did have a copy of Wall's book. So he uses this to create his own fictional cult in this story, his own fertility cult. And I've always wondered about the Black Stone. I mean, this is clearly you can read all kinds of Freudian stuff into this. There's a big giant monolith, that the naked girl kisses and everything right before. I mean, it's pretty blatant stuff. Always sort of wondered how much of this is subconscious and how much of this is him overtly putting this imagery in there. And now we know it's.
Turns out it was all deliberate.
All deliberate.
Yeah.
Wall's book is full of phallic monoliths, in these cults and things like that. So he was intentionally putting this stuff in there to create this sort of fictional, primeval European fertility cult. And his book, Nameless Cults, that's the whole theme behind this. The German von Juntz is writing this book of all of these, forbidden and secret cults throughout history. And this is one of them. So that's one of his major contributions to the mythos is this book. And now we know it's sort of a fictional version of Wall's sex and sex worship book, essentially. You want to jump in here, Scott?
Well, and to go along with the Necronomicon and Unos Spreklichen Kulten, we have Clark Ashton Smith's Book of Ibon, which he used in quite a few stories, but which has never really given a whole lot of, detail as to what actually is in that. And that's the one I would really like to see.
Right.
Maybe it comes from White Fang, since he was a London native. But Mark was mentioning the Arthur Machen connection there, and as I was reading through some of the old horror stories the other days, I read The Great God Pan not long ago,
Yeah.
and going, Valley of the Worm and Shadow of the Beast both have these remembered past histories.
Yeah.
That's sort of what Machen is getting at there. And when you're going to borrow, you got to borrow from the best. And Lovecraft and Machen, doesn't get much better than that.
Well, speaking of that, one of the other early stories where Howard starts playing with some of these Lovecraftian ideas is Children of the Night, which begins with a bunch of British and American intellectuals in a library looking at a bunch of occult books on the shelf. One of which is Unos Spreklichen Kulten is on the shelf, Nameless Cults.
Mm-hmm.
Also, they talk about the Necronomicon. They start talking about these things, and so it starts out like it's going to be one of these standard sort of Lovecraftian things. They're talking about these books, and we're about to talk about forbidden knowledge and forbidden cults and these kinds of things. And this is another story that has a huge Mackin influence, because it has a little people theme to it. And so in the middle of the story, though, all of a sudden, it changes from having this this kind of intro that's very Lovecraftian, and in fact, some of the characters in there, they're arguing over different racial anthropological theories, and where the myths of the little people come from, and these sorts of things. And the conversation these characters are having actually mimics a conversation that Lovecraft and Howard had just been having in their letters. In fact, the character of Conrad argues, one of Lovecraft's points, and one of the other characters, I think Taverel, was arguing Howard's theories on this stuff. So he actually transplants, one of their conversations on this stuff into the characters in this story. And so it sort of starts out with this, and then all of a sudden it changes into a much more Howardian story. One of the characters gets hit in the head and has a past life memory where he's this proto-Celtic warrior at the beginning of the Bronze Age, and fighting a lot of these little people, these degenerated race, semi-subterranean creatures. It's very Mackanian. It's very much borrowed from the Shining Pyramid. Actually, I believe Mackin's actually name dropped. One of his books is on that shelf as well. And Call of Cthulhu. He's mentioned in this story. So it's kind of meta, at the same time. He's talking about the Necronomicon is mentioned in this story, a fictional creation of Lovecraft's, and Call of Cthulhu is mentioned, a real creation of Lovecraft. So that's a kind of a weird thing. Howard may be the first one to do the whole gimmick about how Lovecraft was really writing about real stuff in the guise of fiction, which is kind of a common trope now. Yeah. Howard may have been the first one to do that with this story, with Children of the Night. But and then it turns into a real Howard story with blood and thunder and.
I remember in Dig Me No Grave. Do they name drop any of the forbidden texts in that particular one, which seems like would have been an obvious thing to have done?
They do. They do. They Yog-Sothoth is mentioned, and that's also really early as well. It was published later, but it was written very early. And Yog-Sothoth and Golgoroth, which is one of Howard's mythos, old ones, gets incorporated and is mentioned in that. So there's a little bit of name dropping,
but just a little bit.
But just a little bit. But it features two characters that Howard would use quite a bit in his mythos stories, Conrad and Kirwan. So the two of them are sort of the occult detective trope, essentially. But they appear in several of these stories. They're sort of recurring characters. And also another character who's often forgotten, O'Donnell, appears in several of these. And the three of them in different combinations appear in a number of these stories, Haunter of the Ring and several others.
I want to go back to the correspondence a little bit, because something that Jeff mentioned earlier reminded me that I think probably where Lovecraft's and Howard's friendship had probably the largest impact, and this gets back to the title of the panel, is the development of Conan as a character. I mentioned before this 2-track conversation that they were having in the barbarism versus civilization discussion, which has been talked about in so many other things, and I don't feel like I need to rehash it for you guys.
You'll get it in the panel tomorrow on the letters, probably. I'm sure.
Yeah. The thing about that to me is significant is in the process of Howard trying to explain to Lovecraft, how different Texas is and how the boomtowns changed things in the oil industry, mucked up a bunch of stuff. Lovecraft wasn't getting it. He didn't have a frame of reference for any of this. Providence was old when Lovecraft was there. And didn't have this development situation. There was never a frontier for Lovecraft to observe. But for Howard, watching the rural become, or the rural agriculture become oil industry was part of what he had problems with. And this stuff shows up in the Conan stories. probably one of them, and it's weird because when the Conan stories were published, they were published slightly out of order and with some stories missing from the chronological timeline. If you go look at the chronological timeline and match it up with what Howard and Lovecraft are talking about, you'll see Howard explaining to Lovecraft that citizens' rights don't mean a whole lot in a boomtown where the cops are known to swing a club first and ask questions later. And Lovecraft is poo-pooing this idea because all the policemen I know are really nice. And so, fast forward 3 months later, Howard's writing The God in the Bowl, and Conan in the story is bristling at being ordered around by the guards who basically have caught him in the museum red-handed. And Howard and one of the guards says, "Oh ho, a citizen who thinks he has rights, huh? Well, we'll beat that out of him." And so you can see this is Howard working this out in fiction in ways that he wasn't maybe getting a lot of traction with Lovecraft, but at writing these stories he could sort of say what he wanted to say. And
Howard did send that manuscript to Lovecraft.
Oh yeah, and speaking of that, I think probably the greatest final word that Howard ever had to say on any of these subjects was Pigeons from Hell. Brian Leno was the guy who first articulated this idea that when they were discussing folklore early on and talking about the stuff that they liked and what was scary and what was not scary, Lovecraft flatly said, nothing in the South could possibly equal the steeple-roofed terrors of the northeastern coastline with its haunted gables and bleak landscape and all this, and Howard kind of let the matter drop. But if you go read Pigeons from Hell, you have two characters in the story, and they're very much Lovecraftian protagonists, and the whole story is designed, you can read it as a point-by-point refutation of everything Lovecraft said about how the South couldn't possibly be scary. And so it's interesting because we know that is inarguably one of Howard's best stories and certainly one of his best horror stories. And I wonder if it would have even been written, or maybe written in the way it was written, had Howard not been having a reaction to Lovecraft kind of firing shots across his bow, so to speak. So
yeah, he basically took two Lovecraftian characters, two New Englanders, and transplanted them into a Southern Gothic story, full of voodoo and ruined plantations and
made pigeons scary as hell.
And made pigeons scary.
Made pigeons terrifying. That's right.
If only it had a better title. But, what can you do?
Back then, though, pigeons were a common feature of southern forests.
Right.
It was before they all got wiped out.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we've talked a little bit about Howard's Mythos stuff. You mentioned Conan. This is Conan versus Cthulhu, and if we're playing this sort of retroactive continuity game, people did ask me actually when I'm doing the I'm an advisor for the new Conan role-playing game, and actually had several questions right away. Are you going to have Cthulhu-like elements in there, yeah, that's so, because it seems to me that some of the creatures in there might be kind of Lovecraftian, Well, yeah, of course they are, absolutely. Fog in particular, you get two of them. There's Fog and Fog, which are very, while not Lovecraftian, there's really probably more Safaguan type creatures,
Yes.
which was actually a creation of Clark Ashton Smith. But Howard seemed to really like this sort of toad with tentacles, sort of lecherous creature, and he seems to include Safaguan-like creatures in a lot of his stories without calling them Tsathoggua. The Black Stone is another one. That's a sort of Tsathoggua-like creature. I know Bob Price thinks that's Golgoroth, but I disagree.
Yeah, me too.
I think that's more of a Tsathoggua type creature. And Howard seems to be the one to sort of add, and this may be from the sex cult thing, the sort of lecherous aspect to these Tsathoggua-like creatures. They're always sort of this fat, bulbous toad-like thing
Who
that's
leer
that's
obscenely.
leering, yes, lusting after some woman, almost a Jabba the Hutt, and Princess Leia type imagery that Howard liked to play with.
Yeah, back in the mid-'70s, I met and talked with Jim Turner, who was the editor at Arkham House for quite a long time. And he said, when you really get down to it, Cthulhu is nothing but a giant man-eating frog. And you start looking at that and going, he said, with tentacles. But,
Yeah.
and that's really the truth of it all. When Jim was publishing at Golden Griffin, the last book he edited was Cthulhu 2000.
Yeah.
Which he said, it's my last giant man-eating frog book.
Well, so we're about halfway through. You got anything else you want to add before we pitch it out to the audience? Or some questions, or
I think we should go straight to the audience
Let's do
questions,
it.
including that hand at the back belonging to that lovely gentleman.
Paul.
Hi.
Hi, Mark.
Hi.
Just to go back to the Black Stone, are you guys familiar with the Black Stone erotic trilogy by Justine G?
Oh, yes, I'm familiar with it. I have not read
I've got
it.
right here. The first one's called Red Monolith Frenzy.
Yeah, I'm familiar with it. I have not read it. I swear.
Actually, it's not. It's very strange. It's a Lovecraftian, Howardian prose hybrid with lots of sex.
Yeah, it's erotica. It's,
But the straight dramatic horror conventions of it are actually very well written.
Yeah.
And she's very well steeped in Howard and Lovecraft. So it's just interesting that Blackstone has now become so explicit.
Yeah, it's actually, I have heard of it. Bobby Gary, who wrote Sex and the Cthulhu Mythos,
Yes.
just recently actually was telling me about it. So I did check it out and read the description, and I have to say, supposedly, it's Lovecraftian, Howardian erotica, but it's supposedly actually pretty good. Take that as you will.
Just bringing it up to date.
Yep.
It is pretty good. Or so I've been told. Next question, please. Way in the back. Hey.
It's Jonas.
King in Yellow,
Yes.
right, which is also the fictional. Do you know if Howard had a copy of that? Because I know Lovecraft talks about it in Supernatural, and it just seems like it's one of the first one of like, here's a fictional thing that I'm going to incorporate into a metafiction sense.
He must have had a copy.
Well,
I know.
Did
he doesn't. He didn't, and this is an interesting thing. And Rusty can address this
What you
because
have to say, what you have to say is, if he had one, we don't know it.
Right.
But he was a fan. He was a fan of Chambers' historical novels, but we don't know that he ever had a copy of The King in Yellow. There's no evidence.
Right, and in the letters, he tells Lovecraft, I've read some of these other books. I haven't read any of his weird fiction yet. I need to do that.
Okay.
And because he read his Revolutionary War novels and things that Rusty's alluding to, they some of them had a big influence on Beyond the Black River, for example.
Yeah.
So he was reading. That's what's kind of ironic. He was reading Chambers, but he wasn't reading Chambers' weird stuff.
What reading good stuff?
He wasn't reading the good stuff.
Right.
He was reading, the
Mediocre stuff.
And if you've read some of those Revolutionary, they're not that good. I tried.
The shop girl romance,
Yeah.
I think, is the best way they're described.
Yeah.
Girl
And so he did. Lovecraft was like, you got to read this other stuff. Slayer of Souls is another one that I don't know. There's things in there that make me wonder. Man, did Howard read this? Because it seems like he might have, but we just don't have the evidence for it.
Was it ever published as a blue book?
No.
Okay.
Yeah. Great question, though. Bill?
What would you consider some of the more, some of the stronger Conan stories that could be included in the mythos?
Ooh.
Well, Zoothal of the Dusk is the obvious one. I'm not sure it's necessarily one of the strongest Conan stories. He kind of revisits that same theme much better with Red Nails later on.
Yeah.
But that one's obviously that's probably his most Lovecraftian
What about
creature there.
Tower of the Elephant?
Tower of the Elephant
Tower
is
of the Elephant.
cosmic horror, and is you know, yoga, is that yugoth, you know? I mean, there's maybe a nod there, you know.
Well, and the elephant-faced guy, there's always drawn with the head of an elephant, but you know, that's
It
not.
usually have multiple tentacles.
Yeah, I think it's more of a pseudopod, you know, and so we're talking. It's definitely something from another dimension, you know.
That's actually the art direction I'm doing with the Conan role-playing game. We're going to have a Tower of the Elephant cover coming up, and that's one of the things I tried to really get across to the artists, that this isn't just, you know, sad Ganesha, you know, a man with a you know, earthly elephant head. It's an alien that the closest thing that anyone can come up to, you know, and think of it, you know, on Earth that their brains can wrap around is an elephant. You know? So it's some sort of alien creature that's got some sort of pseudopod coming out of its face that's maybe trunk-like. And so we'll see. I'm actually waiting to get some prelims on that. I hope that, you know, I want to change this artistic view of, you know, it should be a more Lovecraftian, Cthulhu-like look, I think, you know, for Yakosha.
Yakosha uses that appendage to touch Conan and
That's right.
learn about it.
There's, I actually have this idea, and I don't know if Howard would have seen it, but Frank R. Paul was starting in, actually even before Amazing Stories, for Science and Invention, Hugo Gernsback's earlier magazine, was doing these pictures of Martians. And he the Frank R. Paul Martian, he did it over and over again. And I should pull up a picture, but he would have big ear-like things and a long proboscis.
I know what you're talking
You know what I'm
about.
talking about?
That,
That Frank R. Paul Martian, and he started doing that in the late 20s, and that imagery was everywhere. And some of the first ones, one of the first stories where he did that was for Science and Invention, and it's, you know, how would creatures evolve on Mars? How would evolution on Mars be different? And this is what it might look like. And that's such a Howardian idea. I can't help but wonder if you might have seen, you know, some of those Frank R. Paul Martian illustrations, and if that didn't influence some of the Yakosha. But did you want to?
Oh, also, What Shall Be Born, which is a little more straightforward. It's not quite Cthulhu Mythos so much as just borrows the monster.
Right.
But there is some creepy family stuff in there as well, which I think you could certainly look at. And What Shall Be Born, again, maybe not the greatest Conan story, but the sum of its parts is greater than the whole, for sure. You know.
Veil of Lost Women has a.
Veil of Lost Women has a.
Pretty much all. I mean, it's a crappy story, but it's got that cosmic deity coming down.
Absolutely. Scarlet Citadel also. Down in that dungeon, there's all sorts of, you know, Lovecraftian amorphous Shoggoth-like things, you know, creeping through there, you know, as well. Yes.
You don't think Yakosha could be kind of an origin story for the Hindu god Ganesh?
Oh, I think he absolutely is. Oh, well, yeah. I mean, that's, you know, but
God
you know,
from the stars comes
yes.
down to earth to teach. Yeah.
Oh, I think there's no doubt that's what he's doing, and that sort of euhemeristic idea, something that Howard did all the time. You know, here's the real life origin of what became a myth later on.
Right.
Absolutely. Yeah. No, I mean, even the name Yakosha, Ganesha, you know, and that's often what he would do is twist, you know, flip a couple of letters around. Yes, no doubt. And you're right. That came right after he wrote Frost Giant's Daughter, which is, you know, one of his most euhemeristic stories too. Valley of the Worm. He's very explicit about it. You know, here's where the myth of the Dragon Slayer comes from. You know, it was actually this. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no doubt. But I think that, you know, just visually, you know, there was a Lovecraftian influence there, and, you know, and some other things. Maybe Paul. Did you want to add?
I was thinking Valley of the Worm. The worm itself is very Shoggothi in there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
You know, in the book Sex and Sex Worship, Surveying the Cults, that almost sounds like something Seabury Quinn was writing. Every other story was some cult with women chained and being abused. And I almost wonder if there's a Seabury Quinn element in there too, or
This is Mark's topic here. He loves this.
I personally believe that Conan was a deliberate construction designed to go head to head with Jules de Grandin and Quinn's stories in Weird Tales. I think that he specifically was casting about for the right combination of elements that would allow him to get in the books or in the issues, get cover placement, and
Get Brundage.
and get Brundage, and also win the readers' polls.
I think though, wouldn't you say that's mid to late Conan? It's not the early Conan.
Yeah, no, I think the early Conan stuff, he's coming out of his historical period, and so he's wanting to do historical stories, but he's, the research, is a lot. He doesn't have the access to some of the books that people are referencing. There's in Oriental Stories, early on in one of the letter columns, a debate breaks out over one of Howard's of a detail in one of the Howard stories that he had, and it runs for a couple. It's a lengthy debate, and I think I don't think Howard was ever intimidated, but I think that was an example of maybe he didn't have the most recent research. He was using pulps for some of this stuff. And so I think
research takes too much time, is what he said.
Well, I mean, yeah, and when you're reading, you're not writing. So so I think the Conan stories and that world construction, as Jeff alluded to just a second ago, was a deliberate way for him to create a fictional, historical environment that he could tell these stories in, where no one could tell him, you can't do that. And so I think that once the story started hook to hook with Wright, what I call the middling Conan stories, these things in the middle, is where you start getting the slave girl with the gossamer robes and
the whipping,
and
the bondage.
That's where you get the guys showing up, leering evilly over them as Conan comes through the door and stuff, and they have certain similar elements to them. And those are the ones that were tying with Quinn, first and second place, getting covers, and so yeah, I think that was a deliberate thing. He and Howard and Lovecraft talked about it a little bit in the letters, and of course Lovecraft hated Quinn because he just considered him the worst hack, pandering to the masses, with their prurient tastes, and it was just not his bag of tricks.
But that's what Quinn was always doing: the
Yeah.
bondage and the whipping and the torture scenes. The weird, it was weird menace, type stuff. Except that the menace was truly weird and not,
And so this is my personal thing. I feel like Howard was writing specifically to the market at that point. He knew that that's what Wright was buying because that's what was selling, or maybe that's what Wright really liked. Either way, the reason why the Conan stories are probably not the best place to look for themes that are you can't. I don't think you can use the Conan stories, for example, to show how Howard felt about women, because you find that the Conan stories tend to be the exception rather than the norm when looking at the rest of Howard's body of work. It's only here. Or, it's the same thing with the Spices. There's stuff in the Spices that you don't find anywhere else. Yeah. And we tend to not factor that into, his defense of women or sword woman. I think it was a market consideration. And so Quinn was definitely the guy that Howard was angling that stuff off of. And it worked, at least until Weird Tales stopped sending him money, but kept publishing the stories.
What about Hand in the Gal, where Conan was supposed to be a mercenary, and he tried to use an offbeat thing about the medallion and the staff, and how he developed that at the end, trying to use the sorcery aspect of it.
In which story? I'm sorry, I didn't hear.
The Hand in the Gal, is it?
That's actually, that story was finished by Lynn Carter and the camp, and so those aspects of it, that wasn't really Howard. His story was very fragmentary. Only about the first page and a half or so of that is actually Howard, the Hand of Nagal. So yeah, it's kind of hard to comment on that. That's actually a pastiche. The very little of that was actually Howard. All of that you just talked about was Lynn Carter. I think it was mostly Lynn Carter in that story, as I recall.
Tied into that.
Yeah, so that's more Lynn Carter than it is Robert E. Howard. Yeah. Far back, Jonas.
2 questions. Mark, you mentioned before that you thought the Shadow over Innsmouth, the actual action narrator is that's because of Howard influence on Lovecraft. Did we talk about that in New Orleans?
We might have talked about it. There's no proof of it, obviously, but Shadow over Innsmouth is like a Lovecraft story where people are punching and running and jumping around and doing stuff rather than just reading a book and looking up in horror. And so, and there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing, I make no, this is not a judgment call. It's just that, Shadow over Innsmouth is my favorite Lovecraft story because the guy is at least an active participant in the story. And I think a lot of us feel that this was Lovecraft maybe trying to work some Howardian stuff in, but it doesn't really jibe in the timeline, other than the fact that we know that Lovecraft was reading Howard and had commented on Howard prior to their actual correspondence as like, this is the guy that's doing good stuff in the magazine. So, it's speculative, but the fact that it doesn't show up anywhere else, very likely,
And I got a second one. So in one of those Cole stories, the slave is Cthulhu, or not really, but it's very close as far as the name,
Cthulhu.
right? Who's like the wisest of
Oh, yeah, Cthulhu's, yeah.
And it gets mentioned like one line in the letters. Do you know if there's anything else around that?
Other than Howard basically saying, yeah, just dumb luck on my part. It's Call of Cthulhu had already come out. So I suspect that it was Howard writing quickly and probably riffing on the name, maybe even subconsciously. I don't think it was a conscious allusion.
Yeah, me neither. I just didn't know if there was something I was missing in that scholarship.
No, it's not until...
That's the name of Skullface.
It's Skullface, yeah.
Skullface. That's earlier than...
Yeah. Yeah, Cthulhu's predates Skullface, but then there's another reference to that afterwards as well. But it's not until like the third letter exchange that Howard says to Clyde Smith, I'm going to ask Lovecraft if I can use some of his stuff in my letters, in my stories. So that's the beginning of Howard and Lovecraft putting stuff in on purpose.
Lovecraft uses Cthulhu's a couple of times.
Yeah,
he name drops Howard's Cthulhu's once or twice in his stories. Smith might as well. Did Smith mention Cthulhu's? I can't remember. So that is a name that gets name dropped by a couple of other guys. That's one of Howard's characters that comes out.
It's a good evil wizard name. What are you going to do?
Without having an X.
Yeah.
You mentioned just briefly. You mentioned Shadow over Innsmouth, where you get these deep ones, these sort of pre-human fishmen creatures, and Lovecraft, he sort of visited that theme much earlier in his career with Dagon, and that was actually one of the first stories that Lovecraft had published in Weird Tales, fall of '23, I believe. Something I've been working on lately is Men of the Shadows, which is another early Howard story. It wasn't published until after he died, but it's a very early Brand McMorn story written in early 1926. And those of you who know some of my work, I do a lot of looking at Howard's world building. And one of the interesting things in Men of the Shadows is that Howard's Lemurians, are actually descended from fishmen that come out of the sea. And he talks about this in Men of the Shadows. And so I, started to wonder, is he getting that from Dagon, which he would have probably read in Weird Tales a couple of years before. And it's interesting because in the drafts of Men of the Shadows, the Lemurians are ape men that evolve, into Lemurians. But for the final version, he changes it to fishmen. And, so it may be that may be some of the very earliest Lovecraftian influence on Howard, that he, maybe we started thinking about Dagon, and he's dealing with this specific island. Hey, wouldn't it be cool? Forget the ape men. Would it be cool? Fishmen, just like in Dagon. That's what I'll do. I'll tie it in.
So, there's no way to know for sure, but that may have been some of the earliest Lovecraftian influence on Howard.
Yeah, can we dip into Solomon Kane a little bit?
Sure.
Is that okay?
Yeah.
I see lots of mythos influences in the Kane stories. I think there's one, The Footfall Within, or something like that, where he's got the Staff of Solomon, but it turns out that it's an artifact of millions of years old, and then he's fighting some sort of old one, if I recall. So, is there that influence in those stories? Because I see it.
I think so.
Yeah. Cosmic horror is great horror.
Yeah.
In that particular story, that's the last Solomon Kane story that he wrote.
Yeah.
And it's 31. I think.
31.
So it's right after he started corresponding with Lovecraft, so the influence was starting to seep in there. I don't think in the early Solomon Kane stories you see quite so much Lovecraftian influence.
You get the Vampire Queen, but that's just Weird Tale stuff.
Yeah. But what you do get is, if not overtly Lovecraftian stuff in the early stuff, you do get the idea that Howard is playing with the idea that you have this character whose whole cosmology is so wrapped up in the Judeo-Christian worldview and mindset and framework. And as the character develops, he keeps encountering things that start to break down that worldview. And the real world is much older, darker, scarier, and really doesn't care about you at all. And that's part of the theme with Solomon Kane. That's what's going on there, I think. And you can even see the character himself. There's times where he's like, this is even older than whatever, I can't even wrap my head. No, it's just a work of Satan. It's just a work of Satan. And he, tries to hang on to it, and then, and that's part of the character's arc.
I think the fascinating thing about it,
and that's cosmic horror.
Yeah, he tries to keep reframing his worldview with his Puritan notions. And yet you see that he practically lives in a godless Lovecraftian universe.
Yes.
The world is constantly bigger than he thinks,
right.
yeah.
And so even if it's not Lovecraftian overtly, he's getting at that same idea that Lovecraft was trying to get to,
right.
And playing with that, but through the lens of a very devout, fundamentalist, Christian character.
Thank you.
One more question.
Sure.
And then we'll wrap up.
Okay.
Back in the back? You had your hand up? Yes?
Oh, yeah. So was Howard submitting his stories to Lovecraft before they were published, or did Lovecraft just read them in publication and go, oh, there's not?
All of the guys circulated unpublished manuscripts, but then
if they've been rejected.
Right, if they'd been, but then a lot of times they were all buying the same magazines anyways, and on occasion, when they got tear sheets back, which was part of proof that they had been published, they would send those around to one another. So anything that the guys missed would usually get disseminated in some fashion like that.
I mean, but Howard's thing wouldn't be published before Lovecraft read it?
No, he wouldn't. Lovecraft wasn't a beta reader for Howard or anything like that. Yeah.
One of the funny stories about them circulating the things that's sort of related to the mythos is Clark Ashton Smith's creature Tsathoggua. He circulated that story before it was actually published in Weird Tales, and I believe both Howard and Lovecraft saw it before it was published in the Tale of Zadara Sampros or whatever. Lovecraft actually used Tsathoggua in one of his stories and name dropped it like a month or two before the Clark Ashton Smith story did, and Howard name dropped it in Tsathoggua and I think Children of the Night.
Yeah.
That was either the same month and the same issue as the Clark Ashton Smith story. So, that quickly they were already name dropping each other's characters because, and in this case, it probably was the tear sheets that he sent around. So they actually name dropped Clark Ashton Smith's creation, before at the same time Smith did because of that. All right. Well, guys, thank you so much. We appreciate it. We're going to head back to the pavilion for some lunch. The three of us will be around, so if you have any more questions, come hit us up.
Yep.
Talk about this stuff. You'll have a hard time getting us to shut up when we get on this stuff. So.
Yes. Thank you, folks.
Thanks.